Hello, everybody. I'm glad you can join me on a Monday. I normally start off by saying happy Monday, but I know that's kind of like the beginning of the week for a lot of you. But hey, I thought we'd have some fun this afternoon. I do have a game to run at 7 o'clock tonight, and I've been doing some prep and kind of been doing some thinking about a lot of the social media chats and other things that I was reading over the weekend and kind of getting inspired by the different questions and challenges a lot of storytellers are having out there. So I thought maybe today just kind of cover encounters and even show you a sample encounter through my battle cam to kind of give you an idea of how combat encounters often, which are the most common encounters you tend to have in your game. Although that doesn't mean you're limited to just combat encounters. I mean, you could use puzzle encounters, you could use diplomacy encounters, persuasion encounters. Um, Most encounters do benefit through the concept of initiative, but I would say your combat encounter is exclusively integrated into initiative. So, for those of you that have already been playing this game for a while, and if you feel like you have a pretty decent grasp on how your encounters work, I would say that I'll try to sit this way so that I don't bump my table and jiggle my battle cam. Um, I would say that encounters can be daunting. You'll hear a lot of people say that encounters took like 2, 3, 4 hours. Um, Sometimes when you have a really good session going, maybe you don't want to start an encounter because it can be very overwhelming if it kind of disrupts the current flow of the session activity of the day. Um, so these are all things that can be concerning and a little dissuading at times. But remember, like anything that you practice, the more you practice, the more you adapt and the more you improvise within your game. You can do the same thing with encounters. Um, it's more of a skill of organization and managing your encounter more than anything else. So, with that in mind, I've got the D&D Beyond counter beta system up in the background, but we may not touch on that. I'm not really sure, as I typically like to kind of keep this free form and just kind of share with you mechanics and certain situations. So as you can see off to the battle cam, it's kind of a typical combat encounter. I will say, however you choose to resolve initiative becomes pretty tantamount or very important to the overall way that it helps you kind of manage the encounter, the organization of the players, the organization of the protagonists or antagonists, whichever involved in the encounter. Now, I've just set up a simple 4-player character group. I've got a orc barbarian, human barbarian, a tiefling, sorc, and a human monk. Right, just simple, basic, spread out classes. But this is why initiative is important. So before an encounter happens, excuse me, before an encounter happens, it's allergy season, unfortunately, and I get a little bit nasally during this time of year. There's a couple things that might influence your encounter that's about to happen. And depending on the encounter type that you're running, these influences can either improve the um, DCs or other checks that you want to do prior to the encounter starting. Now, typically, if you're not running a combat encounter and you're running maybe like a puzzle encounter, a persuasion encounter, a diplomacy encounter, an investigation encounter, right? Or a retreat, or what I like to call the runaway encounter, those very rarely need tabletop terrains. Those very rarely need very many aids. Those are usually things of theater of the mind. If you use D20 and you like to build those pieces out, go for it. I think whatever tools help you. I think you should use them, because the more tools that you're comfortable using, the more simplistic it becomes for you as the storyteller to manage the encounter. Now, you'll hear a lot of terms like free action or surprise action. If before the encounter, the group as a whole, I usually do it as a whole. If you want to do it at the individual level, you can, but let's say they're as the group as a whole has a very good stealth, or they've done something that's allowed the creature encounter that you've organized not to detect them as they come into the encounter. I usually say, okay, you get one free action, which means the surprise occurs, and as a free action, they can do one thing. And that doesn't require initiative resolution. I'll just go around the table and go, okay, your free action, your free action, your free action, right? And then they quickly describe that for me. And their free action could be to shoot at the monster, or to run over and engage it directly, or to go invisible, or to do whatever it is that they choose to do as their free action. To me, it's a great way of rewarding a group that is, sneaking up on an encounter, or using a lot of their role-playing abilities, or a lot of their other abilities within their group to actually, improve their odds when they're going to run into this encounter. Now, a lot of my encounters are resolved by theater of the mind. Some encounters, if I feel like they could potentially drag out longer, I'll use my battle cam setup with miniatures and terrain to help, complete the immersion effect, and knowing that it's quite possible that the encounter can take quite a while, to resolve. So I will typically have a setup like this. Now, a few questions that I did see out there. And by the way, if you are watching, feel free to ask me any questions you want in chat. I have no problem answering them at all. One of the challenges that I've heard over the weekend is how do you organize everything that the characters can do during an encounter? Well, one of the things you got to remember as a storyteller, it's not really your job to run their characters. Now, if you have a lot of new folks at your table, you're going to be doing a lot of helping and organizing. That's a different question, right? So depending on the people at your table is going to determine how much involvement you are as a storyteller are going to be involved in their organizational effort. So if you have a bunch of new players at your table, the basics for any encounter resolution is always to start with initiative. Now, you can either roll the d20, add the modifiers, and organize the initiative list, right? If you find that too slow and cumbersome and you'd rather keep it simple, you can run initiative off of everybody's decks. So based on both the mob's decks as well as the individual players in the group's decks, you can determine the order of play that way. Now, the order of play is important because of the way characters, as well as either creatures, monsters, or NPCs, protagonists, antagonists, whatever you want to call them, engaged in the encounter. You kind of need that order to help you understand what you should be doing within the encounter, right? But the three basic rules are move, bonus action, and action. And the beauty of it is you can do them in any order that you want. You can also, for your move, you can fractionalize it, right? So you can move 10 feet, use your action to attack, and then if you have a skill, you can then use your bonus action to move away from the target, right? Because you still have some potential movement left over. The typical movement is 30 feet. Typically, 5th level or higher, more bonus action abilities begin to accumulate, but 5th level and under, there's not a whole lot of bonus action opportunities, and I do create a lot of custom flavor for that for my players, because I know it can be frustrating to have a portion of your ability or a portion of your round just not usable simply because there's a mechanic in your character sheet that says you don't have any bonus action. One of the standards I use for bonus action is offhand attack. If you have a bonus action, you can make an offhand attack. You just, you don't get any of the benefits of the bonuses. And if you're not proficient in offhand attack, I usually have you do it with disadvantage. But it's a way for you to utilize bonus action in case you don't have it. Now, the order of play, right? So the highest initiative goes first and the lowest initiative goes last. A typical turn is 6 seconds, and a typical round is made up of 10 turns, right? Lasting a minute, right? And I know it seems kind of an oxymoron to realize that you're playing an encounter that could potentially last hours that is essentially resolving maybe a minute or 2 minute of in-game activity, depending on how long that encounter drags out and how many rounds versus turns that you get in, right? Because if everybody takes a turn, right? If you have a group of 4 players and they're each taking a turn, and you're expecting this thing to go 10 rounds, and that measurement is usually based on the fact that you have barbarians that are raging, or you have spells that are lasting up to a minute based on how they're counting it, right? So you begin to realize that within your initiative encounter and your order of turn, you're developing a timeline for that encounter. And I know that can seem a little overwhelming, but it's also a very helpful realization to have, because as a storyteller, you kind of need some kind of metric that allows you to kind of understand what's going on and also reveal to your players through your narration, as well as watching how the encounter is playing out, that they clearly understand, what's going on, and they can react more quickly. Now, once you've established the initiative order, the free action has already taken place. You may want to help your players by saying, okay, player 1, you're up. Player 2, you're on deck. I've been using that method for decades because it's a great way of helping the next player prepare themselves, so there's not a whole lot of time being consumed in the overall effort to disrupt the flow of the encounter. Because a common complaint about these encounters is that a lot of times people feel like there's a whole lot of sitting and waiting for other people to decide, they kind of hem and haw over a decision. And there's no hard fast and rule for how quickly someone should make a decision within an encounter. Kind of one of those table things you kind of decide during the 0 session. That is, hey, the way I run my encounters, to make sure that everybody gets enough time to be involved in the encounter, I would prefer, you take no longer than 2 or 3 minutes to, resolve what you're going to do. This, especially with your larger table games, when you have a 7-person table versus a 4-person table, 2 to 3 minutes for 4 people is a 12-minute, round, or 12-minute combined turn. 7 people's, 4 people at 2 to 3 minutes, 8 to 12. 7 people, 2 to 3 minutes is 14 to 21 minutes per turn. You could see where, if people took too long, some people might get a 20-minute turn while other people are looking at, going, we don't have enough time to finish the session. Where's my 20-minute turn? So, to kind of de-escalate those challenges, setting that initial encounter expectation is pretty important. I would also say that free action, initiative, organizing the players, letting them understand that move, bonus action, and action can be used in any order, and completed in any order. The only thing that's used in a specific order is reaction. And reaction is fairly simple to remember. You get 1 per round. 1 per turn. If you're in base, so for example, if the barbarian were to be in base with the were rat, right? He's currently in base. If he were to move away from the were-rat, as long as the were-rat has not utilized any of its reactions and he goes to move away, then the were-rat gets that one reaction per turn. But if 3 people are in base with him and all 3 move away, he only gets 1 reaction. So it's not like he gets a reaction per person moving away, right? So a lot of times your players might recognize that, seasoned players, and they'll wait till the tank moves away. That triggers the reaction, right? And the reaction is triggered. This would afford the opportunity for anybody else in base to move away and not trigger that reaction because the reaction's been used. It's just one more mechanic you got to kind of keep tabs on. Obviously, the more monsters involved in the encounter, the more tricky it can be as a storyteller. The other thing, too, is if you're helping newer players, it's okay to walk them through this. Your first encounter is going to be longer. They're going to have questions like, well, how far can I move? And then you're going to kind of, go through that whole understanding of how far they can move, what they can do, the differences between difficult terrain, normal terrain, depending on how your encounter's set up. If you're a newer storyteller with newer people at your table, try to keep your encounters simple at first so that people can enjoy the encounter more than getting bogged down in the mechanics that could kind of make it a bit more tricky for them, right? Because it's going to be a learning curve for everybody, especially the newer players, right? They're going to be looking and going, I don't know what to do. And as a storyteller, you're kind of going to guide them through, or at least help them understand what they're capable of doing. You don't necessarily want to destroy their ability of choice right out the window because you set up this encounter and you want to see how these players are going to, evolve within this encounter, right? So, order of initiative, high initiative goes first, low initiative goes last, and then the numbers in between the high and the low tell you what to do. A lot of times you'll read something called lair initiative. I use these a lot if I have a big bad or a major encounter that's forming up and the lair has an action. Obviously it can't move. If you really wanted to get creative, you could, but obviously you can't move the lair or anything like it. Lair will typically have an action like an effect, like maybe bubbling lava or a lightning rod that's randomly striking around the area, a gaseous cloud maybe that's pulsing out from areas of the surrounding cavern, stuff that the creature that resides in the lair benefits from, and obviously the party that's encountered the lair won't benefit from. This is a real fun way of inserting that balanced ability of, the character's overall damage output, AC, hit points, etc., versus your encounter's overall, damage output, AC, and hit points, etc., right? Because you don't want it to be like this and like this, right? You want it to be as close to this. We talked about that balance last week. And now, because you're running a combat encounter, you get to now start practicing whether or not that balance actually exists and actually works, right? So we're going to say the orc rolled the highest initiative. The orc decides to move, directly engaging with the were-rat. So 5, 10, 15, 20 feet. Moves those 20 feet. He's now engaged with the were-rat. He's going to roll his 2 attacks. We'll assume he's level 5 just for giggles. Rolls his 2 attacks. Now those 2 attacks are his action, right? So that's his move, his action. And he's utilized his entire action because he made 2 attacks. The only thing left is a bonus action. Now, depending on how the person's built or, however they've built their character, we'll say that the orcs decided to rage. That's their bonus action. Now, they still technically have 10 plus more feet of movement left. The orc could decide to bonus action, like the orc could decide instead of moving directly into base with the were-rat, the orc could say, okay, I'm bonus action rage, right? Move my 20 feet, in the base with the where at, right? So that's the movement. And then use 2 attack actions while enraged, because that'll do more damage than if he does it after the fact. But I just wanted to show for you that the order of activity is, important, because for newer players, they may think that they have to move bonus action, or move, like they may think there's a specific order they have to follow, even though they don't, right? I mean, these are 3 options they can use whenever during their turn, right? So during their turn, they can move, bonus action or action, bonus action or move, right? You may want to help them understand that the order that they do it could impact how well their outcomes are going to be within the encounter. But for the most part, it creates, it helps them understand that the order of that particular function of what they do within their turn isn't specific. It can be how they choose it to be. I know a lot of confusion out there in regards to, is it always move first, then this, or is it this, and then this? Don't even worry about it. You can do it in any order that you really want to. And it helps the players kind of feel like a little bit more in control of their outcome. So we'll then say that the second is the Sork. The Sork decides not to move, right? So the Sork stays still, right here, stays put. They, use whatever spell as their action, right? So, action could be attacks, could be spell casting, right? It will typically say for the player, which is what? Once again, as a storyteller, if you're playing with seasoned players, managing your encounter is important for you to manage. You shouldn't be managing how the PCs are playing their characters, because they have the sheets, they have everything they need to know. You're the referee, right? You're just trying to give them a balanced encounter for them to practice what they should already know for your seasoned players, right? If you're playing with newer players, it's okay to walk them through. You'll often hear it referred to as metagaming, but metagaming is unavoidable up to a certain point, especially if most of your players are newer at the table, because they really need your help. They've done what they can to learn, and now you're in the most complex part of the game, which is resolving an encounter. They're going to ask you a million questions, so just be prepared for it. So the Sork casts a spell. Once they cast a spell, there's usually a DC save associated, or not. It could be an attack spell where they have to actually roll to attack, right? That details for the player to understand when they read their spell description. It should tell them everything they need to know about their spell attack that they're doing, right? So that resolves. The where-at rolls its save. It either passes or it fails. Typically, if it passes, it'll tell you in the spell description what the outcome is if they pass versus what they fail, right? If the DC 18 con check is required, that means they have to roll an 18 or higher, right, to avoid taking either full damage or possibly shrugging off the entire effect, depending if it's a cantrip or a spell, right? So the other nuance of spell casting, and this comes up a lot, this has been a frequent topic of the social media chats and everything that go on out there. One of the cantrips versus spells, right? So there, I believe, is one alternative rule or one usable rule that I think if you're a Sork or a Warlock or something, you can stack a spell on spell. I'm not really sure. I'm never really a player. I'm always the forever, storyteller. But for simplicity purposes, you cannot use a spell and then another spell, right? So you'll also notice that players, as they check their bonus action and actions, right, if they can bonus action cast a spell like Spiritual Weapon, and then during their action they try to cast another spell, they can't do that. Technically, the complexity of spell casting forbids that from happening, right? However, cantrip, which is the art of practicing how to cast spells, right? A cantrip is a separate kind of reference. They can, however, cast a cantrip. And I do believe, depending on whether or not it's an action or a bonus action, you can cast multiple cantrips. But I think the challenge with that is often cantrips limit themselves based on the fact that they're either consuming a bonus action or consuming an action. So sometimes when you consume that action or bonus action, that's another limitation to your spell casting anyways. Now, as a storyteller, sometimes spell casting can get daunting, right? Because there's a range to the spell. There's an area of effect potentially of the spell. There's some casters that have the ability to control the damage output of the casted spell and who's affected by it, while most spells you can't really control that, right? Especially if it's area of effect. So that's when the storyteller and the player have to work together. A lot of times when you have a spellcaster, it makes sense to interact with that player and say, okay, read for me the spell, or like there's quite a few that I memorize just because they get used so often. But I really do enjoy with my newer players. I like to have them read the spell. That way everybody at the table, and I almost treat it like as if it's a, verbal semantic material process of the component, right? Or, as part of the act of the spell. That way it kind of allows the whole table to understand the effect of the spell and what's being cast. So that goes the Sork's turn, right? So now the Were-Rat, I tend to homebrew my monsters, so I'll give you an example of how a homebrew monster could kind of evolve very differently within a combat encounter, right? So in this particular case, this Were-Rat, I'll say, is one of the ones. Hey, Maka, how are you? Good to see you. So this homebrew Were-Rat is one of those ones that I like to really challenge an encounter with, where they have action surge baked into their monster stat, right? So what I can do with this Were-Rat is I can have it use its attack action to make its 3 attacks on the orc, and then it's going to move away and then go after the caster. Now, when it moves away, it's going to bonus action surge, and as a bonus action surge, it's basically going to take another action, right? Well, it's going to use its action for evasion. So it took its attacks on the orc character, moved away from it without eliciting a reactionary attack because it used bonus action surge, its movement, and it's done. Now, this is where another way I balance my encounters is not all my monsters are dumb. Monsters exist for a reason, right? They've become either evolved and they exist in the world that they exist in, and therefore they shouldn't all be treated, the same. Monsters can be smart, they can be stupid. Once again, because I homebrew all my monsters, it's a great way of challenging folks during encounters. So you'll notice already the orc went first, the sork went second, the Were-Rat went third. Now the fourth one to go is going to be this the human barbarian. The human barbarian is going to bonus action rage, move 10 feet to get into base with the 10 feet to get into base with the Were-Rat, right? And essentially now the Were-Rat's flanked because it rushed the caster, right? So the barbarian is now flanking the Were-Rat because the Were-Rat's now in base with a monk and a sork. So what does that mean is that even though he's raging, the barbarian may recognize this and say, well, instead of being reckless, right, I'm just going to take advantage of the flank and get my advantage on my attacks. Now, the other thing, too, is the barbarian finishes its turn, and the fourth person to go is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth person to go is the monk, right? So the monk's going to go. The monk's in base. The monk has a special ability to be able to get out of there without, triggering an attack of reaction attack, right? So the were-rat has not used its reaction ability yet, right? However, let's retcon that a bit, and let's say he did. Well, if this monk wanted to move out of base for any reason, moves backwards the 10 feet to be out of base, that doesn't trigger a reactionary attack or an opportunity attack, because an opportunity attack requires that you have an available reaction. Therefore, you can move away. Now, once again, these are things that the storyteller has to keep in mind managing the encounter, because we just now finished, the first, round of 5 turns, right? Each of the creatures took a turn. We finished the first round. Essentially, combat mechanics within the encounter, 6 seconds just went by. And the best way to think about this is imagine a swirling melee of activity going on. Players moving in, pulsing out, things, it's not linear like you see it, right? It's not, I don't know if anybody's ever done any kind of LARPing or SCA or any kind of Ren Fair fighting or whatever. Obviously, you don't stand there and wait for someone to tell you what to do. Obviously, the game mechanic requires this part to feel a little bit linear as you kind of organize it and control it. But think of it this way. In reality, it's a swirling melee that's shifting in and out of the same space with the different characters that are in base with you. The rules allow you to monitor what players can and can't do within that evolutionary encounter, right? So essentially, one round went by, everybody got their turn, and then we go back to the top of the initiative order, and then based on that initiative order, we do it again, right? And again and again until the encounter resolves itself. Now, there are many different ways an encounter can resolve itself. The target of, the antagonist target could be destroyed, killed. It's one way of doing it. The antagonist could surrender or try to run away. But sometimes that'll turn into a pursuit encounter, which are some of my favorites. I think those are lots of fun. Or the antagonist has an escape route for when they're losing a fight. There's only so many unique ways for an encounter to resolve itself. Another way is that the encounter can then evolve into something more complex. Let's say 2 more were-rats show up, right? Or some other creature shows up because it's attracted by the disturbance of what's going on within, the chamber, right? So however long this takes is based on how you've determined your encounter should take, right? Which is why if you're newer to encounter management within D&D, keep it simple at first and then gradually exercise that muscle to make it more complex, right? So for example, at the high end, I may have a layer effect here, and at initiative 20, that layer effect kicks in and creates a challenge. I may have this encounter based in such a way that maybe after 3 rounds, something else kind of wanders into the encounter because it picks up on the activity. But I don't do that with purposeful intent. I'll roll for it. I'll go off to the side here, and I'll pick up my trusty D20 and I'll roll, and I'm checking somebody else's perception to determine if they can hear this ruckus going on. If this is after the initial first round of it, normally they're checking with advantage because it's so loud, right? The combat is loud, they're clashing, there's yelling, screaming, the sound of spell effects, reactionary volume that's kicking in because of everything that's happening. So from that perspective, I'll then, take 2d20, have my offsite or whatever's making a perception check, they either pass or fail. Now, if my alternate wandering encounter has a passive perception, then, normally what I'm checking for is for them to, I'm applying a DC to the noise that's being made and whether or not something coming by or is nearby is actually going to be able to hear that activity that's going on. Obviously, the longer that activity goes on, the higher the higher the DC is from a perspective of them trying not to be heard, right? Um, the lower the passive DC becomes. So let's say they're in the middle of their fourth round, which is the equivalent of 24 seconds going by. I mean, anybody passively is going to now hear the combat encounter because it's been drawn out for so long. They're going to hear it within a certain amount of range. And then this encounter has the ability now of evolving something into something a little bit more complex and a little bit more challenging. So don't worry if your were-rat's not doing that great, right? If your were-rat's struggling, I mean, there's opportunities for you to use the rule mechanics. I mean, don't try to kill the players just because they're doing well. The idea of the encounter is for your players to use their skill sets and how they know how to play their player within your encounter to then resolve the encounter in a very neutral fashion from a standpoint of a storyteller. They're not trying to beat you, right? You're the referee. You're managing how the encounter is playing out. Now, as soon as the target of the encounter is destroyed or runs away or surrenders, however it gets resolved, you then essentially could fall out of initiative and people could begin to describe to you what they'd like to do after the encounter is resolved. That's pretty typical for all encounters, whether it's, we talked about a puzzle encounter, right? So, or I mentioned it. We didn't talk about it, I mentioned it. A puzzle encounter could be where it's a room with lots of different puzzles that have to be resolved to either reveal treasure, a hidden passage, or perhaps even a hidden monster that's going to reveal itself because they inadvertently solve, the puzzle, or they make incorrect attempts at solving the puzzle. I always like the room filling up with, green slime or ooze or spikes gradually opening up in the floor. It's a little bit tropey, but it's still kind of fun. That puzzle reward, puzzle punishment system is, a great way for other players within a group during a puzzle encounter to use their other skill sets for the type of game that they may enjoy more than just typical combat encounters. I mentioned diplomacy or persuasion encounters. Now, the puzzle encounter, maybe you need initiative depending on how you've got it designed. If you don't, then don't use it. Initiative is nothing more than a tool for you to use as a storyteller to organize and manage the encounter as it's playing out. That's really all it's there for. It's predominantly used for combat encounters, but you could use it for other encounters if you chose to, because especially if it helps you resolve that particular encounter. So diplomacy and persuasion encounters could be your players role-playing out their ability to influence a local council or a regent or a magistrate or a shop owner or the head of a family that they're trying to convince can or can't do something. These are things that typically don't require initiative, but they're still, for all intents and purposes, they're encounters that have to be resolved. And the resolution of those encounters could be influenced by a potential, imminent conflict or combat encounter, or the de-escalation of one, right? Maybe they want to use their skill sets to de-escalate what potentially looks like it's becoming an encounter, and they're not prepared for it. Now, typically, right, after a combat encounter, your players want to do things like investigate. They want to search for things. They want to examine things. They want to, do the really fun thing after they've, kicked in the door, killed the critter, and they want to now, as my girlfriend says, roll the bodies, right? For all intents and purposes, you could remain in initiative for that if you felt like that will help you resolve the back end of the encounter, right? Because the front end is the free action surprise, that free action, the encounter itself, which consumes many rounds and many turns, move, bonus action, action in any order of those three. And then, boom, you have the activity of after the combat encounter. things like investigate, perception, medicine check, survival check, nature check, intelligence checks, right? Um, just because they're successful at the encounter shouldn't mean they're automatically successful after the encounter, right? There should be difficulty involved in a dimly lit, were rat lair, just strewn with detritus and debris and, seemingly abandoned for years and the stink of raw sewage. I mean, these are all the things that are supposed to create that immersive effect so that when they're done with the combat encounter, now they can be challenged with trying to find whatever they're trying to find within the area. So don't just give it away for the sake of giving it away. Now, something else that comes up a lot, I've talked to this with my other players before, and I do some unique things during my combat encounters, and in some cases, my other encounters as well. Sometimes players want to be creative in how they respond to the encounter, right? So let's say somebody, wants to climb a wall. A lot of times I'll hear frustrated responses like, a storyteller doesn't necessarily want to deal with the challenges of that. And they'll just say, no, you don't see any place to immediately grab a foothold or a handhold. Well, let them roll, give it a high DC because they are in the middle of combat and let them roll. If they do beat the DC, then describe for them, because they've consumed their bonus action for a quick perception check. You can say, well, from where you're standing, not more than 5 feet from you, you can see that the wall is poorly constructed. There's many protrusions and what could be conceivably handheld ways of both using your feet and your hands to climb up the side of the wall and possibly make your way up towards the perceived target location that they're trying to get to. So their bonus action was consumed doing that. They move over to it, right? To determine their successful way of doing that, you can use athletics or acrobatics. It kind of depends on you as a storyteller how you want to resolve that, right? If it's a fighter, I would actually challenge them different ways, right? If it's somebody who's athletically proficient, right? I would say, well, give me an athletics check. And let's say they roll like a 22. And then I'll say, okay, great. Now give me dex save with advantage. And that allows them the opportunity to use their move. And because I'm going to treat it like difficult terrain, right? Because they rolled so high on their athletic, right? It was half their move to get up into the wall and get 5 feet up into the wall, right? The dex save is for flavor. It's to determine whether or not they can actually do it without falling and causing problems that way, right? So just because they're in a combat encounter doesn't necessarily mean that you have to automatically restrict the creativity. Now, as I know for newer storytellers, the more creative you allow your players to be, the more work it kind of seems like to you as a storyteller. And that's okay. A little bit more work, right, means more exercise and more practice, and allows you to practice your organizing, how to organize the outcome of the encounter. But stated earlier, if keeping it basic for the first couple sessions and the first couple encounters as you're getting used to the folks at the table and the table's getting used to you the way you kind of like run your game, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Because you're going to meet again. There's going to be multiple sessions, lots of opportunities for you to practice your encounters. And I would say this is another great way of practice too, which is run one-shots. When I run my one-shots, they will always have an encounter of some type, whether it's a puzzle, diplomacy, persuasion, or whatever. There will always be an encounter of some sort that's in the middle, right? There's a beginning, a middle, an end, and a one-shot. The more one-shots you practice, the more encounters you can practice, and the more fluid you get with the type of players that you play with, the more creative you're willing to let them become. Now, I'm a very seasoned storyteller. I've been doing it for 40 years. So my muse is allowing my players to be as creative as they can within the confines of the encounter mechanics, right? If they're describing something that could easily take a minute to do, Well, they can't do it as an action because we know a combination of an action, bonus action, and move technically should not exceed 6 seconds. That combination, right? So the idea of trying to describe something outside of those bounds, it's okay to push back to your player and say, well, what you're describing sounds very complex. I would say you can do this and this, but you can't do all of it. That way, they understand that there's a limitation to the basic understanding of the mechanics of the game, which is if I'm going to do a move, bonus action, and action, technically that's supposed to only take 6 seconds long for when that happens. Now, with that in mind, things like free actions can be played out in the middle of an encounter. I always have a lot of fun describing the condition of the antagonist to my players. That way, as a free action, they could yell something out, and the whole party can hear it. The other thing too is I may describe the were-rat. Well, there's big clumps of fur that have torn away from its flesh. You can see gaping wounds in its shoulder and chest. It seems to be breathing quite heavily with great long, sinuous-looking droplets of drool coming out. Its eye is swollen shut. All that allows me to describe during the encounter the condition of the protagonist, the antagonist, so that they better understand how well they're doing. I'm not going to necessarily cause it for them to, consume one of the three, right? The bonus action, or move. Some things can be done within a quick glance of a second, right? You're glancing at your opponent. Now, if they want to take the time to size up their opponent, I'll use a different mechanic for that. I'll say, well, you can use your action to make an investigation check. And now they've got a balance. Is that really a good idea to use their action to make that investigation check? And I think, as you practice that more and more within the encounter and the way the encounter is, you're attempting to design your encounters, then you'll find that your flow of your encounters improves every time you run one, because you understand better what to expect. Now, if you're running multiple tables, I would always recommend becoming a bit more senior in your play style and in how you run your game before you run lots of tables. But run lots of one-shots for sure, because that's practice, right? You don't have to maintain a campaign note system. You don't have to maintain a lot of heavy notes about each of the sessions, right? The one-shots really are like, working out at the gym, right? Like you're working out and you're working your adaptation muscle, you're working out your improvisation muscle, you're working out all those things that help you run a solid combat encounter, because let's face it, 9 times out of 10, that's what players want to experience. They tend to be more focused on the combat encounter, which is why I kind of just want to do a quick little brief run through and understanding of what that combat encounter could potentially look like. Now, obviously, I'm using terrain, I'm using minis, I've got a cool battle cam. I'm able to share the battle cam with the players because right now everything's still pretty much online. So obviously running an online game is different than running a tabletop game or, an in-studio or in-game, game room game where you're all at the table. I don't have a preference for either one anymore because I've been so heavily immersed into online gaming now that I'm beginning to think very differently about the pros and cons. But I will say this much: resolving encounters in person are a lot easier than resolving encounters online, because unless you're fortunate like I am, and I am fortunate to have organized myself in such a way that I can share a battle cam and allow people to, have at least some kind of reference, right? There are other ways of doing it out there. You can do like Roll20, you can do Astral, you can do all the different, I believe Owlbear Rodeo is another simple and easy way to manage your encounter with tokens and imagery and mapping and stuff like that. I I usually I usually try to resolve my encounters with theater of the mind because I like to practice that. I mean, even though I've been doing it forever, I still like to practice it because it allows me to be very creative in my descriptions. It forces my organizational skill to be challenged and organize it in such a way. Oh, and by the way, if you prefer pencil and paper, that's fine. I use this little gadget here, and it's called a Boogie Board. And what's really cool, it has a lock and unlock method. I can quickly, right? I can quickly write on it, make my notations on it, do what I probably can't see it very well, but I can just write on it really quick, right? And then when I'm done writing, I can hit the button and it's been cleaned up, right? So I can always take a picture of it with my phone or whatever and use it to do alternate notes later on. But it's super lightweight. It's not wasteful. It's constantly, you just reuse it and reuse it. And you can, for your combat encounters, you can use it to organize, the different mobs and the initiative and everything. If you're fortunate enough to have an actual table game going, stat trackers is what I usually use. The little index cards that you can fill out and hang them on your DM screen, and then you use those to organize your initiative. I'm a huge fan of stat tracker. Those are really fun, and they usually give you just enough information on the reverse side of the stat tracker that you hang. It at least gives you the basic understanding of your players at the table, stats, saves, passive, stuff like that. So in case you want to do secret rolls based on their, interaction with your world or your encounter or whatever, you can then make those secret rolls, write them down ahead of time, right? In an encounter, I tend to, while my players are resolving what they want to do, I'm already rolling attacks and damages and stuff like that ahead of time. Well, not so much damages because I do like the looks on their faces when I roll for damages. I mostly do it for attacks. That way, when it's the monster's turn to go, or if I have multiple monsters, I've already got a resolution on those that remained in base because they intend to stay in base. Obviously, if they're not in base yet, those kind of pre-rolls aren't necessary, but sometimes those types of preparatory rolls can help you maintain the flow of the encounter that you're doing, so you don't lose the flow. I typically, based on the folks at your table, right? Sorry, I'm gonna take a drink. Based on the folks at your table, if their expectation becomes they expect an encounter every time you have a session, that can become daunting. I usually try to break it up quite a bit so that there can be role playing and there can be intrigue and there can be other activities going on. I typically like, if I do a theater of the mind encounter, it's usually to resolve something that's not overtly in depth. If a certain skill level of a group has come across something that's somewhat below their encounter expectations, play it out. If they stumble upon, a giant snake, right? 45 minutes of theater of the mind can usually play that out. In some cases, they immediately intimidate the target and the target runs away. Play those out because even though they may turn into combat encounters, it's a great way of practicing what your players can and can't do within whatever you're trying to accomplish within an encounter. So whether, be mindful, it could become very exhausting if you start having encounters like every session. You could get burnt out. It can begin to feel very burdensome to manage it, knowing that every time you walk into a session, you could potentially have people that are expecting an encounter every time. So try to balance that out. Try to change that up to a certain degree. The other thing I would say, the last thing I'd say about encounters is that if you jump over to YouTube, I did publish my balance encounters, and we talked heavily about balancing the encounters. But combat encounters are decisive points in either your campaign or your one shot. Um, Create a lot of immersive effects for your players, whether it's how you describe the damage or how you describe what the creature is doing. Um, it helps. It just kind of and don't be afraid to try it, because the more you try as a creative person, the more likely you're going to begin to pull that creativity back from your players that are sitting at your table. It's a very vulnerable condition that people put themselves in when they play this game, um, because you're doing a little bit of gameplay, role play, um, and you know, a combination of that can be daunting for some folks. They can find it very intimidating, or they find this this type of game. Um, I have to block that. I don't know why people do that, because pay to play is always the way to go, I guess. Um, Normally Vince is on moderating for me, but I think he's working today. Um, so you know, I would just say that the more immersion you provide during your combat encounter, then the more choices that your players are going to feel like they have. They're going to feel um, they're going to feel like that their damage matters, that their decisions matter, and they do, right? Because the order of how they do things could greatly impact or affect the outcome of that encounter. And I think that's important to help them understand, so that they become more creative in any of the encounters that you put in front of them. So, all right, well, that's pretty much it for encounters. I was thinking of diving into the D&D Beyond encounter system, but it's still in beta. I got to be honest, I usually build my encounters very differently. I'm gonna probably come back to this as a separate chill session, and we can just walk through how their encounter system is done. Also, I plan on doing some stat block creations on how I homebrew my monsters and homebrew my baddies and NPCs and stuff like that in my games. I'm currently getting ready to start a new Sunday campaign. It's going to be called The Founding of Dark Toe. It's going to be based on the creation of the Revelry and the rebellion against the Marquise, and it's going to be pirate-centric. I do have a game. If you jump over into our Discord, there's lots of games going on. I have a One Shot Presents every other Thursday, Thursday night from 6 to 9 p.m. West Coast time. As a Discord member, you just click on accept the event. All the campaign link has all the information you need for that event. You create either a level 5, 10, 15, or level 20 character, and we run a one shot together, and it's usually run as a teaching, learning kind of situation. We do have our Friday night game, which is called Age of Arcanum. It's Dark Sun inspired. And that is Friday nights from 7 to 10 p.m. West Coast time. We've also got 2 shows on Tuesdays. We have Denizens and Their Masters, which is a Adventures on the Menagerie Coast. That is from 7 to 10 West Coast time. And we also have our Titans Revival, which is Tuesday afternoon from 12 to 4 o'clock West Coast time. But if you go to our About section in Twitch, everything you need to learn about us is right there. Just, click on the clicks and click on the links, and you can find out everything you need to know about us. We're a very open community. We are part of the TTRPG community and all the folks out there that are supporting that community. It's a fun community. We support it on Twitter. I support as many creators as I can afford to. It's not always easy. I wish I could afford them all, but I can't, but I try. So like I always say, try to be very safe out there. Try to be very kind to each other. And if you can, try to play a game. See you, everybody. Bye.